Okay.
Oh. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Darren. I'll be going through what I did for the restaurant reviews at stage 2 for MWS. And feel free to send in questions to the group chat. Brenda from UD City will be monitoring that, and she will alert me about any messages that you send in. But for this session, I'll be covering what we have actually received beforehand from the Google Forms, and also what I've done for the project to get past stage 2. So a little bit about myself. My name is Darren. I think I said that. And professionally, I'm actually a .NET. I call myself a technical .NET full stack developer, in the sense that I basically do front end and back end, except that I'm not so good at design. Meaning, don't ask me about color coordinations, and I'm bad at that. Although I do have a minimum baseline on what to do with that. And personally, I do JavaScript projects, and I like JavaScript because it is, I feel it's a pretty cool programming language if you use it properly. Okay, so for first things first, let's go into the stage 2 specifications and requirements. So this slide that you see is basically what I rip out from partially the rubric and also the specifications and requirements. So within the specifications, what we need to do for stage 2 is to use server data instead of local memory. So in stage 1, we were loading all the restaurant information using a JSON file. In stage 2, we'll be loading it from a server, and I'll show you how to do that later. And then there was this it's kind of requirement specification, but it wasn't clear in the rubric. And there was actually a line, I believe, within the specifications document that says that it's preferred that you use the fetch API. And then looking at what we learned when we did the scholarship challenge, I would recommend that you use fetch instead of the XHR because of first, XHR is it's old technology, and then it's not as easy to code compared to fetch. And then the other requirement that we need to do is to use IndexedDB to catch the JSON responses. And we also have to meet the minimum performance requirements for Lighthouse. The first requirement was the progressive web app score should be 90 or better. Performance score should be 70 or better, and accessibility score should be 90 or better. And there's also a link to the rubric here. So it's like, and let's go into the first requirement that we have, which is to use server data instead of local memory. So the first thing that we actually need to do is to get the code from the GitHub repository. Then there's actually a README instructions on what you need to do to install the add-ons you need for the server, and then how to start it. And before you do any other things, what I did for my project was I made sure that my server setup is running properly. And you could test it either using Postman. There are some links here on getting Postman as an app on your machine, or you could use it as a Chrome extension. Or you could use Fetch using DevTools, as long as you have the local host on. So let me stop sharing this. Okay, let me try sharing something else. I'll show you how to do how to test your server now. And let's make it out. Okay, maybe I'll share the one screen. Okay, so here, you see? Do you see this? Do you see the command terminal? If you're able to see it, can you put in something in the chat? So I know that you can actually see that. See it. Okay, so in this terminal, what you see here is actually what I re-downloaded from the GitHub site. And then what you want to do is actually to do an npm install. It will actually grab all the plugins or all the modules that you need. I ignored all these vulnerabilities because we don't care about it. We are not doing production, so it's fine here. Then the next thing you want to do is you need to do npm start. So once you do npm start, it will show you these messages in the console that tells you that I have started my server on localhost 1377. And the next thing you could do to test this is I'm going to bring up Postman. So this is Postman, and this is how you could actually test whether a server is working. So we know that our local host is 1377, and then it's actually a REST API. And to get data for REST API, you use like the get method, and the endpoint for us is restaurants. So you could just send this, and it will actually show you the list of restaurants if your server is working properly. And you could even test getting individual restaurants. I could do this for one. Then this will get me one restaurant. This is one way to test it. The other way to test it, let me just make sure my local host is running. So this is, I'll show you what I did for here. Errors. Thing might be. Okay, I didn't install my packages earlier. Sorry about it. So now if I run this, wait, let me check something. Sorry about it. npm run start dev. Sorry, I forgot to build my application. And I need to do this not on 8000. Sorry about that. Let's see, localhost 8000. So you got to do it from localhost. The reason is if not, you'll get cross. What do you call it? You get the cause error. I can't remember the full term for it. And then let me get this. I cheat. So I have this. So you can actually execute a fetch. Sorry about that. So you can actually execute a fetch from the console. So if I were to execute a fetch from the console, this will actually show you the list of restaurants. So with this, we are actually sure that our server is working. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. So now we finished the first step of ensuring that we got our server working. And the next thing you need to do is you actually need to change the code that you wrote in stage 1 when it was using the fetch API to make requests to the server to populate the content. And then the changes you need to make will mainly be in your DB helper .js. And for my case, I name my service worker file service underscore worker.js. So in your case, it could be sw.js. So depending on the scenario, for the item 2, you will do different changes. So let me go through what I did for this. Okay. Okay, so let me just refresh my code here. These refreshes, let me close. Okay, so this is Visual Studio Code, the editor that I'm using, and I actually moved my code back to stage 1 so that we can go through where the changes that I made. So first thing first, of course, you got to change this database URL is no longer localhost 8000 JSON file. Instead of that, you need to do localhost 1377 and restaurants or whatever you call it. And the next thing that you need to change is this xhcar call to get the JSON file. Instead of doing that, now you'll be calling the REST API here using the fetch command. And using the fetch command, will give you a list of restaurants which you'll pass back to the callback. And then the other changes that you will need to do will be the URL. So the image URL, in stage 1, restaurant.photograph contains the extension. In stage 2, the REST API doesn't return you the extension. So you got to put in the extension yourself. And you also need to skip the call to the REST API. So within your service workers fetch call here, you will need to skip the call to localhost 1377 so that you don't actually cache that in here. Because for my case, I didn't do my caching within the service worker. I actually cache it within the database. And so let's open up this screen. So for my project, these are the changes that I actually did to get from the REST API. So we'll be sending out this presentation as well later, and the link will be there. If you want to see what I actually did to get data from the REST API instead of the file, this commit here will actually show you all the changes that were being made. And just to let you know, this is a feature of Git. So what it does is it tells you what the code that we remove. The green ones are the ones that we added. So this will give you a good idea of what was being changed. And let's see if there's anything here which I think, yeah, that's all for this slide. Okay, so here we finish changing the API, changing the app to grab data from the API instead of the JSON file. So the next thing we need to do now is we need to use IndexedDB to cache JSON responses. And for JSON DB, and for IndexedDB, I will actually break it into two parts. The first piece, which I call infrastructure code, and the second piece is actually the feature code. So the difference between the two is infrastructure code contains code to transpile and bundle to create an app. The reason we need to do that is, for my case, I decided to use the import statements because getting in the IndexedDB code to work, or at least the version that was provided by Jake, to work without using the import is pretty tricky because you need to introduce a lot of global variables. And then the second part, which is the feature code, which is the actual code that you perform to read data from IndexedDB or write to it when you get it from the REST API. So first of all, we go into infrastructure code. Infrastructure code, for my case, there's two parts to it. Transpilation. I use a lot of ES6 within my code. So we got to translate that, transpile that into ES5 because not all browsers will support all the ES6 code. And the other thing that was required there was also the import statements. It will not work if you don't transpile them. And besides that, you also need to do browserify, and that will be part of the bundling. So for transpilation, the tool that we commonly use in JavaScript is Babel. And on top of Babel, there's something else that is for bundling. So the next thing, bundling. So what is bundling? So in web development, when we say bundling, what we do is it could contain the transpilation process, but the main thing that you do is you actually combine your code or even like assets from multiple resources so that it can be consumed by the browser. And depending on the bundler that you use, sometimes you got to use browserify. And why that was being introduced, this is my personal opinion, but bundling was created because HTTP 1.0 is inefficient to make multiple connections. But when you work in a professional environment, you usually break your code into multiple code files. But to get around the deficiencies of HTTP 1, you will usually want to combine those code files into a single one so that when the browser gets a file, you get a single file instead of multiple files. And then it also allows you to use modules. It could be import statements, or it could be the require statements, so that you don't introduce global variables. So one of the things that people hate JavaScript is everything is global. So when you try to debug, it's always tricky to find out what goes wrong. Okay. So for bundling, what are the choices that we have? The three most popular one is Grunt.js, Gup.js, and Webpack. So the difference in between the three is Grunt was one of the first bundling tools that came out, and it's configuration based. So instead of writing code to do bundling, there's actually a configuration file that you write to instruct it to use whatever plugins that you need to do the bundling. And Grunt, because during the bundling process, it uses temporary files. So everything that you do, you create a temporary file, store it somewhere, before the next process reads from the temporary files to create the next set of outputs. So that's the reason why people say Grunt is slower than Gup. And for Grunt.js, you need to use browserify if you need any code that needs to run in the browser. Then Gup.js, it came after Grunt. It's code-based, so everything that I do is actually a line of code, and you can actually debug it if you want to. And then it uses memory for the work in progress items. So that's why you see some packages like Fin. So what it does is uses memory streams. So whatever process that you have, it creates a memory stream, stores it there. The next process will read from the memory stream and produce a final output after that. Then Webpack. Webpack is the latest. It's one of the newest one with I think Rollup. I'm not too sure about Rollup. I've used Webpack, and I tend to still do Webpack nowadays. But for this project, I decided to use Grub, and I'll go through the reasons later. So Webpack is also configuration based, and I know it's used by Create React App, and I believe Angular from what I've seen in their package JSON. And because Webpack was built for like client-side applications, so it requires a lot lesser efforts if you want to use imports, and it supports tree shaking. So what is tree shaking? Tree shaking allows you, the bundler, to read the import statements that you have in your code, and then it tries to trace the dependency tree. So every import statement that you have in your code, it will actually look for the next file. And then with a little configuration, what it allows you to do as well is, instead of what I think Gub and Grunt do is, if you have 3 JavaScript files, even though that you bundle together, even though you don't use all the code within the 3 files, when you do bundling for Gub and Grunt, it will actually combine all the code together. So if you have 100 lines in 3 files, it will become 300. Webpack, because of tree shaking, you will just take whatever code that you need. So in the event, say you have 50 lines you need in file 1, 50 lines in file 2, and 100 lines in file 3, their end result will be 200 lines of code instead of 300. So that produces a smaller footprint, which is good for like performance purpose. And then Webpack also supports code splitting. And it's not that useful previously, but with HTTP 2.0 coming up, when multiple connections are allowed, HTTP 1.0 only allows 6 connections at the same time for most browsers. And then each connection they make, there's a heavy overhead for the headers and the other stuff. But HTTP 2, all that changes. Number of connections no longer matter. The overhead for each connection is smaller. So now the previous thing where I told you about bundling, where people used to combine all files into a single one, you no longer need to do that. So you could split your files smaller, but that's only if you turn on like HTTP 2. And Webpack does that pretty easily compared to Grunt or Gub. But the reason why I chose Gub for this project instead of Webpack is Webpack, it loads your styles and CSS, and it actually combines it in the bundle. And I'm not that proficient yet in Webpack to make sure that we don't import the styles inside the bundle. And then, because one of the criteria of our project is to have high performance, so I was concerned about the final bundle being too heavy. So that's why I decided to do GubJS instead of Webpack. Okay, so with that, let me just take a look at what I have for the Gub file. And I gotta close this again. Let's get this out. Since I did Gub, so let me show you how Gub looks like. So first things first, if you want to use Gub, you got to do npm install, and most of the time you use npm install --save dev, so that your package gets saved as a dev dependency. And then if you create a package JSON file, what you'll see is actually a GUP here as one of the dependencies. So when someone downloads this repository, and if you do an npm install, all these packages will be downloaded for you. And if you look at it, this file, there's dev dependencies and there's dependencies. The difference between these two is dependencies are required for production environment. Dev dependencies is required for development if you want to do testing. And if you are doing bundling or whatever, that's when you download these packages, but not when you need to do production. So, and for another thing with the package JSON, for my case, I like to create scripts in npm. So that's how, when you look at what I did here, I could do npm run build. So this is actually a command here. And this actually, what it does is I'm telling it to run gup. And when gup runs, you will try to look for a config file. And the config file is actually gup file.js. I'll go through this layer. And there's another command that I created just to run the server. So the reason why I showed you this is in a lot of documentations online, they'll tell you to install gup into your global node modules. Most cases, that's fine. I don't like doing it. And then, especially if you run Windows, if you're installing global, it tends to give you problems due to security issues. And then in new versions of Node, so my Node version is 10, and also I can't remember which version was it, but I think from npm version 5 something onwards, you no longer need global gup. You can actually run gup locally. So provided I have actually installed gup in my application folder, when I run it from npm using this, so if I do npm run build and I give it the command gup, what it does is it goes to your local node modules and it runs gup. So I believe that runs it from here. If you look in node modules, there's a bin folder, and I think this is the one it's running. But don't quote my words on that. Okay. So now we could run gup locally, and let's look at the gup file. So another disclaimer here. I actually use gup4 because when I learned gup a couple of years back, gup4 was the latest version. And somehow, for some reason, they never released that into production. And it's been 2 years from then, and I think they're still on 3.9. So the syntax might be slightly different, but I like gup4 instead of 3 because gup4 allows you to consume functions. So you can write simple JavaScript code, and you can run it as a task within gup. But gup 3.9, most of the time you need like some plugins. So certain scenarios you still need plugins in version 4. For instance, I have like the prefixer, CSS cleaner, concatenating files, source maps, and Agrify. So in my gup file, you have what you call tasks, and there's a default task here. So this here, what it does is when I do a npm run gup, it calls a default task, which is actually running a series of tasks called build all and watch. So this is the process that I do for bundling. Watch, what it does is there's a task here called watch here. You actually look in my source file, and every time I make changes, you will bundle everything. And then if you look at build all, it's actually a series of functions that I'm calling. So I call clean, which is up here. So what it does is, because I put all my files in the build folder, so I just delete the build folder and start afresh. Then I ask it to build the HTML, and if you look at here, what it does is I want GUP to go into my source folder, which is public, and grab all the HTML files, and I just want it to copy it into the destination folder's public folder. So the HTML files will be copied here. Then the next task is building CSS, and same thing here. The build CSS actually is a series of tasks. Because we have two files, so I split my CSS into two different files. So this builds the index and this builds the restaurants. And when I build the CSS, basically I'm taking several files here. Then this does the clean. And auto prefixer, what it does is, because my CSS, I didn't do any of the browser prefixes. So what it does is automatically prefixes whatever you need for, like, whether you want to do it for Firefox, IE, Opera, or even Chrome. And I wanted to do it for the two versions before. And then I'll concatenate all of them into a single file, then return it into public CSS, which is what you see here. And well, the next task is to build the scripts. Same thing here. I'm doing browser 5. So first thing, I'm asking browser 5, go and look at my JavaScript file, and then transform it with Babel, and then bundle, and then do the source, by the source. And source maps, I'll show you later if we have time to do debugging. So because the problem with arguifying is your scripts now become unreadable. So when you debug, it's tricky to see what you wrote. But that's why you got to put it before arguify, and then piping it back into the destination folder. So this is how I built using GUP. You could do the same thing with Webpack and or Grant. And what it does here is it combines a file into one, so it improves your performance. And then it allows you syntaxes that weren't allowed if you were to just write pure JavaScript. So this is bundling. Next thing, let's get to the meat. So, so we got bundling out of the way. So now I'm allowed to write JavaScript that looks like this, which is import IDB from IDB. So now I could use Jake's IndexedDB code easily. And well, there's some things like ES6 syntaxes, but that's not important. So with bundling out of the way, now let's look at what are the changes you need to do to get DB helper to store data into IndexedDB. A disclaimer here. Some of the code that I might be sharing in my Git repo, you'll look drastically different from what was the original version from USD. Reason being, I decided to rewrite everything because I think one of the questions that I had from the form was, what was the biggest challenge I had on this project? The biggest challenge was everything was done as a global variable, and for me, I'm used to not coding with global variables, so it becomes tricky. And when I was coding initially with the global variables, I actually introduced a bug, and I'll show you where that was inside the IndexedDB file. I can't remember whether it's DB helper or it's one of the files that there's a default value for the parameter that if you are not careful, you could pass undefined in, and then it caused a bug that took me a lot of time to figure out that I decided to rewrite everything. But that aside, what you basically need to do for stage 2 is there's 2 tasks to do to get data. First, you need to grab all restaurants from IndexedDB. And if it's not empty, then you can just return the results and end the process. It doesn't sound correct in production, but at least for stage 2, there's no updates to the application. And then usually if you have updates, the code will be written kind of different. So for stage 2, I actually ignored the part that the data will be updated. So as long as it's inside the IndexedDB, I'm going to return it. Then the next thing will be, what should we do then if IndexedDB has not been populated before? Next thing is, you need to fetch the data from the server and then store the data into IndexedDB and also return the results. The reason why it's 2 steps now is, of course, your app needs the results. Then you store it into IndexedDB so that the next time you read from it, you will be doing this first step here instead of calling the fetch again. Okay. So, oops. See. There's one code here. Oh, okay. So let's look into some code. This is let me look at this. Okay, so this is what my code looks like to grab data from IndexedDB. The first thing you have here is I actually have a function that I use to open the database instance. So if you look at it, it might be familiar to some of you that you have this IDB open. This is the database name, and then this is the version, and you pass in a function, callback function, so that if the DB is not there, it will perform whatever is indicated here, which is I want the DB to create the store restaurants. And then notice something here, I pass in this configuration object called key path ID. There's a reason for that, in that this key path ID is kind of like setting up the primary key for the table. And the reason why I name it ID here is if you look at the results that return from the REST API, there's actually an ID field here. So later on, when you look at the code to update the DB, I just pass in the object, and that object contains this ID. So you use this as the key to store the entry inside IndexedDB. Okay, so this is like, it's a generic function that I actually wrote out here. So, okay, next we look at how I actually grab data from the database. Let me just percentage case zoom. Okay. Okay. So this is a piece of code that I use to grab data. The first few lines here, actually, you can ignore it, but because I did everything in classes, So I actually have a property called supports offline. If supports offline is false for the browser, then I don't do any of the IndexedDB code. This is error check. And you'll just return the fetch. So if not, what it does is, this is the thing that I showed in the slide, where the first thing that we do is we open the database. And if the database is there, we then open a transaction to get the store and return all the results as an array. Or if the DB is not found or some error, okay, then I actually return an empty array. Okay, so this is actually a promise. So the thing here is, this then, when it returns this result, it will go into the next then in the promise. So this get all returns at least an array of restaurants, or it returns an empty array, which is passed in here as the restaurants parameter. This syntax here is part of ES6 as well. Is async await syntax. I did it here because I didn't want to get into callback hell. Because if not, you'll have to do another promise within this call, which is kind of tricky. So what this does is, I'm saying this function is asynchronous. So if you encounter an await, what it does is, asynchronous functions, usually in JavaScript, it executes kind of using a different thread. But when you have async await, what it does is, when I do this fetch, I'm blocking JavaScript from running till this fetch returns. So the difference between async await and this promise then is, promise then, when you do promise then, it calls it, then only when the callback, when the result comes back, you'll go into the callback and you'll execute whatever is inside here. So you could run other code if you don't use async await. And for my case, I find it's easier to use async await. That's the reason. Here, I ask it to fetch. So this returns the fetch response, and this is actually the response returned from fetch. It supports another function called JSON, and this is asynchronous as well. So I'm asking it to await. So this returns the list of array that I want. Then here, I'm opening a database, which is again another async function. So your block till the database returns the DB here. And then since I have an array here, what I'm doing here is look through the array, get every restaurant, and then store it inside the database. So that's the thing that I was telling you about earlier, when I declared the database with a key file of ID, so that when I did the storing, I just need an object int. IndexedDB will go and look for the ID on this particular object, and then it will save it into IndexedDB. Then when all of this is done, I'll then I'll ask it to return the restaurants. So I have resolve and reject here. It's kind of similar to your callbacks. So what it does is pass the callback the restaurants. So this will return the list of restaurants to the screen. So this is what I have for feature code. This will actually store everything into IndexedDB for you, and also return it to the screens. The next thing we need to do is to meet the minimum performance requirements for Lighthouse. And some of the things I did here was creating a manifest file. There's a link. Let me show you that page. Okay. So on the Web Fundamentals page, there's this file for a manifest file. What it does is this allows you to put your app onto like the mobile's home screen, and it requires certain settings like icons that you put there, and the short name which will get shown, and then background color, and also the display. The display, there's a few different options for it, and I just took it from the documentation here, which is standalone, which will make it look like a standalone, but it still opens your app as a browser. And it was one of the things that you will get warned about within the within Lighthouse. And I actually fixed it in stage 1, but if you have not fixed that yet, then you could do it in stage 2. And the other thing that I did was I lazy loaded my images. And to warn you about lazy load images, there's one thing that I found was I was using scrolling to load my images. So let's see if I can still. Okay, so in my app, my images will load when you are within the browser's viewport. So because I lazy loaded upon scroll, so on this scenario, only the first 3 images are being loaded. And then once you scroll down, the next 3 will be loaded. So the funny thing that I observed was lazy loading images, if you load up your app for the first time and then you turn it to offline mode without scrolling down, the images at the bottom will not be lazy loaded. So if you just access your application from the top viewport, when you turn it offline, you try to access it, then you start to scroll, you'll see all the messages, the images below not being found because it's not been saved into the cache yet. Then I also changed my JavaScripts to use the defer attribute. So let's look at the index. I'll take a look at index HTML. So what this does, let's see, where's my scripts? Yep. So if you look at my JavaScripts, it's all using defer. The difference between that and not putting it is when you put defer, you actually load your DOM and pass it, and the JavaScript will not block it. If you don't put this in, the browser will encounter your script, and then you'll block the browser thread, and that hits your performance. And I also move some of the style text to the bottom. And then, oh, I didn't do it, but one of the things that you could do is you could move your style text to the bottom of the HTML and then keep those important ones that is required for your first pane and also for the first content at the top. And then those that you don't need it till maybe after JavaScript runs or whatever, you can move it to the bottom of the HTML tag. I didn't do that yet for my stage 2 because I managed to hit the performance before doing it. So maybe I'll do it for stage 3. And the other thing that you could do to improve the performance was inlining important styles or assets. I could show you one thing that I did. So I actually created a logo for my app, and then I actually inline my kind of the SVG. So, and you could do the same thing as well for JavaScript. So instead of like referencing a file here, you could put in important JavaScript straight into your HTML. So that's one of the things that you could do to improve your Lighthouse performance. So let me show. Okay, this is see which branch am I on. So I'm in master. Check out. See. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm clearing all the storage, and I'm reloading my service worker so that what do you call it? My previous version isn't being loaded into the browser. And oh, I didn't put in the key, so there's an error there. We can ignore that for now. So performance tab, let's see. No, not performance tab. The audit tab. Okay, so Lighthouse. Let's see what I have here. I have it open somewhere. Don't want this. Okay, so it's a good demo. Lighthouse will fail if you open the tabs. If you open your same site in multiple browsers, it will actually not allow you to run the audit. Let's see if this works. Sorry, it looks like my site type. Finally works. Okay. Let's run this. I'm going to ignore it for now. Let's see if Lighthouse still runs. Okay, by the way, the error here was, I think leaf maps, there's a key there, and my version in GitHub, I didn't put in the key. Okay, so Lighthouse is back. So what I wanted you to show here is, so in, this is messed up because of the map. So in the Lighthouse audit, you actually see all these errors, and then this is my stage 1 app, so it fails. So this is how I know that I need to lazy load my images, which is off screen, and then I didn't do this, and this is where the blocking style sheets come from, minifying JavaScript. So the audits, I would tell you to look into them, and usually if you manage to do to hit the scores here, you'll most likely hit the rubric. I think except for the fact that the IndexedDB, you need to implement it. Other than that, looking at this will help you a lot during the submission, because when this is done, a lot of things that is required for the rubric is actually being checked for. And let's see.
Hi, Darren. Sorry to interrupt here.
Okay.
I just want to give you a 5-minute warning.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I got no more time. So I wanted to show you the stage 2, but I guess we ran out of time for that. So some of the things that I think might be useful for you. For my case, I use VS Code. And then when I do my coding, there's a lot of things about indentation and also like missing commas and stuff. I find that having Beautify, which auto indents the code for you, ES linting, and also for VS Code, you have snippets and debugging. Those are really very helpful when you're writing your code, because it will save you a lot of time looking at why my code is not working. And one thing that it will be useful for you is browser debugging. I was hoping to show that, but we ran out of time for it. If anybody needs help, I think I have a video somewhere. You can select me and I'll send you the video on how to do the debugging. And I guess that's it. So if anybody wants to connect with me, my LinkedIn profile is here. And I actually have the code in GitHub. So there's also there's different stages. And I actually created a V2 tag in GitHub. So if you go to the repo and then if you check, if you clone it and if you check out V2, that will be the code that I actually showed during this webinar. And I guess that's it.
Thank you, Darren.
Thank you.